Welcome and thank you for tuning in. This is an original horror story unique to this channel, so if you like it, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. This story is called Don't Eat the Cookies at the North Pole. Let's get started. It was a typical December day in the North Pole, and Santa sat in a big velvet-lined chair eating his favorite sugar cookie. An elf, who appeared to be about 10 years old, with curly, light brown hair, sat on the ground, rubbing Santa's large feet. "Riley, go get me another cocoa," Santa said, gazing down his long pipe at him. The elf jumped to his feet and ran off over the wooden floor to the kitchens. Santa continued to puff on his cigar, while Mrs. Claus sat next to him, making a doll for Santa to include in his deliveries. The fire crackled before them, and a log dropped, sending a burst of sparks a few inches in the air. Roused from her thoughts by the noise, Mrs. Claus' hand slowed and then stopped. She peeked up at Santa. "Santa, did you remember to check the list twice?" "Yes, I did, Mrs. Claus. The elves gave me the list at the beginning of the month," Santa said, as crumbs from his latest bite of sugary goodness fell onto his shirt. He tried to turn his face to her, but his ample body was wedged in. Mrs. Claus tilted her head to the side, then muttered, "Well, sometimes you forget." Then she pulled her needle tight and sewed a doll arm into place. "Of course, I couldn't do this without my helper," Santa said, and Mrs. Claus beamed. Santa picked up another cookie just as Riley returned with his hot cocoa. "Ah, Riley, you included a candy cane to stir it with. Just how I like it. For a new elf, you're learning very fast." Riley blushed and returned to rubbing Santa's feet with extra vigor. "Riley," Mrs. Claus piped up, "could you get me a hot chocolate, too?" "Oh, Mrs. Claus, I'm getting a really good spot right now. Could you get it from the kitchen?" Riley asked. His elbows stuck out to the sides in an effort to use the most of his strength. "Naturally. Take care of the old man, Riley," Mrs. Claus said, and pushed up from her chair. Then she went to the kitchen and snagged a hot chocolate. With the hot drink in her hand, Mrs. Claus returned to her room and picked up Santa's magical coat to bring to him. She laughed to herself. Where would Santa be without me? Can't even remember to keep track of his coat. All of a sudden, Mrs. Claus' breathing accelerated. She placed her hand on her heart and leaned over, bracing herself against the edge of her bed. But the strength in her arms and legs failed her, and she fell to the floor. She laid, sprawled on the ground for a minute, until she lost consciousness. When she woke up, one of the newer elves, Jenny, sat craning over her, waving peppermint essential oil under her nose. As Mrs. Claus regained her senses, Jenny sat back on her heels and hugged her legs. Mrs. Claus sat up slowly, but even still, stars flashed before her eyes and she laid back down. "Do you know how long I was out?" Mrs. Claus asked and put an arm over her eyes. "Just a minute or two, and sorry about that. I know you think Santa needs you, but I'm sorry, but I heard you say that before you passed out. And again, sorry about that. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, really," said Jenny and rubbed her lips. She glanced around like she was looking for hidden mics. "Jenny, right? You're the new elf? I don't think this is your fault. Why are you apologizing for me passing out? And can you just get to the point, please?" Mrs. Claus asked, removing the arm from her eyes and struggling to a seated position. She glanced at her spilled hot cocoa and asked, "Can you get me a glass of water, too?" Maintaining eye contact, Jenny rose, then broke the eye contact as she turned around to go to Mrs. Claus' vanity to fetch water. She filled the glass from a large pitcher and returned, holding it with both of her hands, and gently passed it to Mrs. Claus, who drained it. Jenny settled next to her. Santa doesn't really need you. He has a whole army of elves that he got in the most atrocious way. Don't you know how he got the elves? Mrs. Claus smacked her lips and laughed. You don't know what you're talking about. The elves are born here. Jenny clapped her mouth shut and stared at Mrs. Claus. What can possibly make you think that? We were stolen from our parents and force-fed those cookies that everyone is eating all the time. Listen, Mrs. Claus. A few weeks ago, I ate a cookie and threw up just a little bit later, so I didn't want to eat them anymore. And guess what? I have memories from a life that doesn't include the North Pole. Please, just try it. Stop eating the cookies just a few days. Oh, darling, you're being ridiculous. Are you saying Santa's controlling us with mind-bending cookies? Mrs. Claus asked, waving her hands around and chuckling. Jenny threw her gaze to the sky, then brushed a hand over her face before she leaned closer to Mrs. Claus. I'm not joking or messing around with you. And I need your help. None of the elves know how to operate the sled, and I'm not going to Santa. Please, just trust me. Stop eating them and you'll see. At that moment, down the hall, Jenny heard her name called and jumped to her feet. I'm coming, she shouted. Then to Mrs. Claus, she said, I have to go make toys, but please just try it. Mrs. Claus, still sitting on the floor, holding her empty glass of water in one hand, thought back to another time when an elf pleaded with her not to eat the cookies. Just like Jenny, that elf was older looking too, probably 15 or 16 when he stopped aging. She hadn't listened to him about the cookies, of course, who would? But as she mulled that memory over, she stopped. I wonder whatever happened to that elf. And an icy feeling crept into Mrs. Claus' heart. She hadn't seen him since he had whispered those frantic words to her about the cookies. That evening, the Clauses sat at their wooden table, eating their dinner of roasted reindeer, mashed potatoes, and carrots served by a fleet of elves. When it came time for dessert, Mrs. Claus sat back in her chair with her arms crossed, eyeballing the cookies until Mr. Claus took note. Mrs. Claus, are you on a diet? Why aren't you eating your cookies? Santa asked, laughing and grabbing a large glass of milk. He took a swig and wiped his mustache with his red velvet shirt sleeve. I'm not on a diet. I've just eaten a lot of cookies already today, and the reindeer were so filling this evening, Mrs. Claus said, and put her hand theatrically around her stomach and sticking out her tongue before she continued. I think I'll just have a candy cane. She reached over the cookies to where a bouquet of candy canes stood in a decorative vase. She grabbed the nearest one and unwrapped the long end of the cane while holding the hook end in her other hand. For the next few days, Mrs. Claus continued to eschew cookies, instead eating candy canes in the evening. Nevertheless, throughout the day, she still grabbed cookies and pretended to eat them whenever she saw Santa. It wasn't until the third day that something happened. Mrs. Claus sat in her usual chair, working on making a toy, when she saw a flash of something in her mind's eye. It was a place without snow. A vast stretch of water moved before her. She smelled salt. Mrs. Claus jolted in her seat. What was that? She thought. She shook her head and focused more intently on her work, but only a few minutes later it happened again. She was back at the place with the water, and she ran, laughing. She hardly wore anything, and yet she wasn't cold. She was outside and almost naked, but warm. In the memory, she realized she wasn't alone. Before her was an elf. No, it wasn't an elf. It was a human child. The child giggled with her and held her hand. When Mrs. Claus pulled out of this memory, she had tears in her eyes. It felt like her heart had settled somewhere around her belly. Mrs. Claus's hands trembled and she wanted a cookie. She craved a cookie and she knew if she ate one, the memories would stop. Meanwhile, as Mrs. Claus slowly regained her memory, Jenny got to work. In the snatches of Jenny's own memory that she had experienced as the cookies left her body, she frequently saw the elf Riley. It took a week of not eating cookies to realize she used to have a family, and that curly-haired little Riley was part of it. Immediately, she tried to not let him have any cookies. She gave him cocoa instead, or accidentally sprinkled cayenne pepper on the cookies near him. Sometimes she just snatched the cookies from his hands and threw them in the fire. She did all this until one day she saw him look at her, and she could tell he recognized her face. As soon as she knew Riley was aware, she made an excuse to get him alone and went to find Mrs. Claus. Jenny found her sitting in her typical chair, making toys, but before her was a large plate of freshly baked cinnamon cookies. Holding Riley's hand, Jenny dragged him forward, but hesitated when she was in front of her. Mrs. Claus ignored Jenny and continued with her work. "Did you eat one of the cookies?" Jenny asked, eyes locked on the baked goods. Mrs. Claus sighed and put down her craft. "No, but these memories, I don't know if it's good for me to have them." Jenny knelt down in front of Mrs. Claus, gripped her hands, and stared up at her. "No, please, help us with this sled. I don't know another way out of here. Do you? Do you want to know who I am? Or who I was?" Mrs. Claus asked. Jenny gritted her teeth and glanced behind her like an army of elves might sneak attack her. She forced herself to be polite. "Who were you, Mrs. Claus?" "I wasn't a missus. I was raising a little girl on my own, and he took her from me." Her voice caught, and she put a hand over her mouth. "Mrs. Claus, or, well, should I call you that?" "I don't remember my real name yet. I've been eating those cookies for too long. Maybe you can call me Nancy," Nancy answered as tears swelled in her eyes. Nancy, we don't have much time. Somebody is going to figure out we stopped eating the cookies, and they're going to get suspicious. The other elves will force us to eat cookies again. Or worse, Nancy, we gotta go." "You're right. The other elf who talked about the cookies, he's gone. No one said anything about it. But if we leave, the big man will find us." Nancy itched her head. "We have to destroy all the cookies. And maybe Santa?" Nancy stood up and grabbed Jenny's hand, who, in turn, reached out for Riley's. Quickly they marched. As they approached the kitchen, Jenny caught sight of Santa around a bend and stopped suddenly. Santa stood with his back to them, indulging in his usual snack of cookies. Before she could control herself, she rushed him, all the fury from him lying to her for years erupting from her. She grabbed his velvet jacket from behind. "What did you do with my daughter?" she accused him. He toppled over and she climbed on top of him. Straddling him, she slapped him hard across the face. From behind, Jenny shouted to the other elves to get out of the kitchen, that the Claus needed some space. Santa laughed. "Uh-oh, someone hasn't been eating the cookies again. Don't worry, I love this side of you. That's why I chose you." The other Mrs. Claus was getting old, and my immortal self needed someone new, someone with some energy. As Santa continued to chuckle, Jenny plunged a knife into his neck. Santa's laughing ceased, and he gurgled. Bubbles of blood leaked out of his neck. Even as Mrs. Claus continued to straddle him, he reached a velvet-clothed arm up towards his neck. Gracefully, like unsheathing a sword, he pulled the knife out of his neck, and the hole mended until there wasn't even a scratch. I told you, I'm immortal. Then to the elves outside he said, Sandra, Jessie, Alex, Luke, anyone else standing around. Mrs. Claus needs some assistance. Please take her back to her room and make sure she gets a big plate of freshly baked cookies. After all, I need my best helper, Mrs. Claus. Obediently, the elves marched in, and 2 of them grabbed Mrs. Claus by the elbows, even as she still sat on top of Santa. They dragged her off down the hall to her room, and she didn't even resist. She just muttered, Santa needs his best helper. Santa needs his best helper. Santa needs his best helper. As for Jenny and Riley, no one ever saw them again. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.